Spring settled gently over England long before the first shot was fired. Fields followed their ancient rhythms. Parish bells marked time, not as urgency, but as reassurance. Roads carried wool, grain, gossip, and habit, moving along paths worn smooth by generations who believed, without needing to say so, that the order of the world was stable. Authority flowed downward through custom rather than command. Obedience was not argued for. It was inherited, like land, prayer, and accent. Nothing in the countryside suggested collapse. Nothing in the market towns hinted at revolution. Even in London, where trade pressed tighter and voices gathered louder, life moved within boundaries that had held for centuries. People disagreed, grumbled, petitioned, and prayed. But they did so inside a shared understanding that England was governed, as it always had been, by a king, anointed by God, restrained by law, and advised by men who believed continuity was their highest duty. What made the coming war so destructive was not that England was unstable. It was that it was stable in ways that could no longer absorb strain. Power had accumulated slowly, almost invisibly, in places no one had been taught to fear. Belief had hardened not through doctrine, but through repetition. Authority had become less flexible precisely because it had worked for so long. Every institution carried memory, and memory resisted change, even as the world that sustained it shifted beneath England's feet. The danger did not arrive announcing itself as rebellion. It arrived as procedure, as argument, as interpretation, as men insisting they were defending the same ancient order while no longer agreeing on what that order required. By the time swords were drawn, England had already crossed a threshold it did not recognize. The war that followed would not simply decide who governed. It would decide what authority itself meant, where it came from, and how far it could be broken before it ceased to command belief. This is not a story of sudden madness or inevitable bloodshed. It is the story of a society so committed to continuity that it could not see how deeply it had changed until change demanded to be acknowledged by force. The English Civil War did not begin when banners were raised. It began when inherited certainty stopped being sufficient, and no one yet understood what would replace it. Hey there, I'm glad you're here. In today's video, I will take you through the timeline of the English Civil War, not as a list of dates, but as a story that explains how a stable world slowly learned how to tear itself apart. If you leave now, this story will keep unfolding without you, reduced to noise, summaries, and half-remembered facts. But if you stay, you choose to understand it the way the people who lived through it never could, with clarity, distance, and perspective. If this kind of history matters to you, stay with the story. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and give these events the attention they demand. Stories like this only survive when someone is willing to listen all the way through. In the decades before the English Civil War, England moved according to patterns so old that few could imagine them ending. The land itself set the pace. Fields were plowed and rested in rhythms, shaped by seasons rather than policy. Spring loosened the soil and invited labor. Summer demanded endurance. Autumn gathered what had been entrusted to the earth, and winter slowed all movement into reflection and repair. These cycles were not experienced as choices. They were accepted as conditions of life, as reliable as sunrise and frost. Villages lay stitched into this rhythm, their boundaries defined not by ambition, but by familiarity. Hedges followed property lines whose origins were no longer remembered. Footpaths crossed fields because they always had. Houses clustered near churches, whose stones had absorbed centuries of prayer, baptism, marriage, and burial. The parish was not simply a place of worship. It was the frame through which time was understood. Bells marked hours, and holy days. not as interruptions but as confirmations that life was proceeding as expected. Most people lived close to the land, even when they resided in towns. Market days followed predictable schedules. Goods arrived from surrounding countryside and departed again with equal regularity. Wool, grain, timber, and livestock passed from hand to hand along routes worn smooth by repetition. Bargaining took place within known limits. Credit rested on reputation. Disputes were settled by custom as often as by law. Nothing about daily exchange suggested instability. The economy did not feel fragile. It felt continuous. Towns grew, but they did so gradually, expanding along established roads rather than erupting outward. London was larger and louder than anywhere else, yet even there, order prevailed through habit. Guilds regulated trades. Apprentices learned their craft, as their masters had learned it before them. Authority flowed downward through institutions that had learned how to persist without drawing attention to themselves. Government was present, but rarely intrusive. It existed as a background condition rather than a constant pressure. Religion reinforced this sense of permanence. The Church of England shaped weekly life through repetition rather than intensity. Services followed familiar forms. Sermons emphasized obedience, patience, and the acceptance of one's place within a divinely ordered world. The memory of earlier religious violence still lingered, particularly among older generations, and that memory discouraged extremes. Stability was valued not because it was perfect, but because instability was remembered as costly. Most people did not spend their days thinking about power. Authority was assumed, not examined. The king existed at a distance, both physically and symbolically. His presence was felt through proclamations, taxes, and prayers offered in his name, but rarely through personal encounter. This distance did not weaken loyalty, it strengthened it. The crown belonged to the realm as a whole, not to individual preference. Obedience was part of belonging. Law followed similar patterns. It was respected not because it was feared, but because it was familiar. Courts operated according to precedent. Local magistrates enforced order with reference to custom. Justice moved slowly, but predictably. Few expected perfection. They expected continuity. That expectation shaped how disputes were tolerated, how grievances were expressed, and how patience was learned. Even change, when it occurred, arrived gently. Improvements to agriculture, adjustments in trade, shifts in population all unfolded over time, absorbed into existing structures, rather than imposed upon them. England did not see itself as a society on the brink of transformation. It saw itself as a society enduring within a known frame. Peace, in this context, did not feel like an achievement. It felt like a condition of existence. Conflict belonged to memory or to distant places. Wars had been fought before, but they had ended, and life had resumed its accustomed shape. That pattern reinforced belief in the resilience of the system. Whatever disturbances arose, people trusted that the familiar mechanisms of authority, faith, and custom would absorb them. What made this world so resistant to imagination of collapse was not ignorance, but confidence. Generations had lived and died within the same structures. They had learned that order persisted not through constant vigilance, but through repetition. The idea that the very foundations of this order could fracture did not present itself naturally to the mind. It required a kind of pressure that had not yet made itself visible. Before England learned how fragile its assumptions had become, it lived inside them completely. The routines of countryside and town, parish and market, law and worship, all reinforced the same lesson. The world was governed. Time moved forward. Authority endured. And nothing yet demanded that this understanding be questioned. For generations before the English Civil War, kingship in England was not understood as a function to be debated or a role to be defined through law alone. It existed as an inherited condition of the world, woven into belief, custom, and memory, so thoroughly that questioning it felt less like political disagreement and more like disturbance of the natural order. The king did not merely govern. He occupied a place within a hierarchy that linked heaven, earth, and society into a single structure of meaning. This understanding had been shaped over centuries. Medieval theology, classical inheritance, and lived experience combined to present authority as something descending rather than negotiated. God ruled the cosmos. Beneath God stood the king, entrusted with care of the realm. Beneath the king stood subjects, ordered among themselves by rank, obligation, and custom. This was not imagined as oppression. It was imagined as coherence. Each part of society had a place, and stability depended on each remaining within it. The coronation ritual made this vision visible. When a king was crowned, the ceremony did not celebrate political victory or popular consent. It marked consecration. Oil was applied, prayers were spoken, vows were taken not only to rule, but to uphold justice as it was understood within divine law. The ceremony affirmed that kingship was not self-generated. It was received. The king became a steward of something older than himself, bound by obligations that exceeded personal will. This belief did not require constant reinforcement through force. It was sustained through repetition. Every proclamation issued in the king's name, every coin bearing his image, every prayer offered for him in parish churches reminded subjects of the same truth. Authority was distant, but its presence was continuous. The king did not need to appear often. His legitimacy did not depend on visibility. It depended on continuity. Obedience, in this context, was not experienced primarily as submission. It was experienced as participation in order. To obey the king was to affirm that the world made sense as it had been received. Disobedience carried implications far beyond immediate consequence. It suggested disorder, not only in government, but in creation itself. That implication gave loyalty a moral dimension that went deeper than fear or advantage. Hierarchy reinforced this logic. English society was stratified, but stratification was not necessarily resented. Rank defined expectation. It organized responsibility. The gentry governed locally. Magistrates enforced law. Clergy guided belief. Each role existed within an understood framework that mirrored the larger structure of kingship. The king stood at the summit, not as a solitary ruler, but as the focal point through which order was understood to flow. Inheritance strengthened trust. Kingship passed through blood, not election. This reduced uncertainty. Even when a monarch proved weak or unpopular, the institution itself remained intact. Criticism of individual rulers did not automatically translate into criticism of the crown. Subjects could complain, petition, or resist specific policies while still affirming loyalty to the office. This distinction mattered. It allowed tension to exist without rupture. Religion bound this structure together. The Church of England taught obedience as a virtue rooted in Scripture. Sermons reminded congregations that authority existed by divine permission and that resistance invited chaos. These teachings were not abstract. They resonated with lived memory. England had known religious conflict before. The scars of the 16th century had not fully faded. Stability, even imperfect stability, was valued because its absence had proven destructive. Kingship also carried emotional weight. The monarch was spoken of as the father of the realm, a metaphor that shaped expectation. A father might err, but his position remained. Subjects did not evaluate kingship through ideological frameworks. They evaluated it through familiarity. The king had always been there. His rule marked time. Reigns provided historical reference points. Events were remembered by the year of a king's rule rather than by abstract chronology. This emotional attachment was reinforced by ritual and language. Loyalty was expressed in oaths, proclamations, and public ceremonies that emphasized unity rather than coercion. When loyalty was sworn, it was sworn to the person of the king as the embodiment of the realm. This personalization did not undermine the institution. It humanized it. It made authority intelligible within everyday experience. Trust in kingship did not imply ignorance of limitation. English political culture included an understanding that the king ruled within law. Magna Carta, parliamentary precedent, and customary rights all existed alongside royal authority. Yet these constraints were understood as part of the same order, not as challenges to it. Law did not oppose kingship, it completed it. A lawful king was not weakened by limitation, he was confirmed by it. This balance depended heavily on shared assumptions. As long as king and subject believed they were participating in the same inherited system, disagreement could be managed. Petitioning Parliament, appealing to precedent, or resisting specific demands did not threaten the structure itself. They reaffirmed it by acknowledging its authority even while seeking redress. The danger arose not when kingship failed, but when its meaning began to shift without consensus. As pressures mounted in the early 17th century, economic strain, religious anxiety, and international conflict placed demands on governance that older frameworks struggled to absorb. Yet the language of kingship remained rooted in earlier assumptions. This mismatch did not immediately produce rebellion, it produced confusion. Subjects continued to think of loyalty as virtue. Kings continued to think of obedience as duty. Both acted in good faith within inherited beliefs. The problem was not malice. It was rigidity born of long success. Kingship had endured for so long that adaptation felt unnecessary, even improper. Alteration threatened coherence. Preservation felt safer than adjustment. James articulated this vision explicitly when he spoke of kings as God's lieutenants on earth, accountable to divine judgment rather than human scrutiny. His language was not new. It reflected assumptions many already held. What changed over time was not belief itself, but the environment in which belief operated. As Parliament grew more assertive and religious divisions sharpened, the old language began to strain under new realities. Still, loyalty remained powerful. When Charles I had inherited the crown in 1625, he did not receive a realm primed for revolution. He received a realm accustomed to obedience, shaped by memory, and deeply invested in continuity. His understanding of kingship aligned with tradition. He believed sincerely that authority flowed downward, that order required deference, and that compromise risked erosion of sacred trust. This sincerity mattered. It explains why conflict unfolded as it did. Kingship was not defended because it was efficient or benevolent. It was defended because it was meaningful. To abandon it felt like abandoning the logic by which society understood itself. That fear would shape decisions long after disagreement hardened into confrontation. Before swords were drawn and banners raised, kingship in England remained what it had long been, a structure people trusted, not because it was flawless, but because it was familiar. It anchored identity. It explained hierarchy. It gave history a shape that felt continuous rather than chaotic. The tragedy that followed would not arise from hatred of this institution, but from the gradual realization that shared belief in its meaning could no longer be assumed. For centuries before the English Civil War, Parliament existed not as a rival to the Crown, but as one of the mechanisms through which kingship functioned. Its authority did not arise from opposition, nor was it conceived as a counterweight designed to restrain monarchy through confrontation. Instead, Parliament emerged from the practical needs of governance in a realm where authority, though divinely sanctioned, still required cooperation to operate effectively across distance, locality, and custom. The English crown ruled a kingdom that was neither centralized nor uniform. Power radiated outward from the monarch, but it did so through layers of local authority, regional practice, and inherited privilege. Taxation, law enforcement, military levies, and administration depended on consent as much as command. Parliament provided a space in which this consent could be articulated, recorded, and renewed without calling the legitimacy of kingship into question. Its origins lay in council rather than resistance. Medieval kings summoned assemblies not because they feared rebellion, but because they recognized that durable rule required participation from those who governed locally and bore the costs of policy. Bishops, nobles, and later representatives of towns were called to advise, to assent, and to help translate royal will into local compliance. This process did not diminish royal authority. It reinforced it by embedding decisions within accepted forms. Over time, these assemblies acquired structure. By the late medieval period, Parliament had developed into a bicameral institution, with the House of Lords representing inherited authority and the House of Commons representing landed gentry and urban interests. Yet this division did not imply ideological conflict. Both houses understood themselves as part of the same governing organism, operating under the crown rather than against it. The Commons in particular did not view themselves as tribunes of popular will, the modern sense. Their members were drawn from a narrow social stratum, men with property, education, and local standing. They did not arrive in Westminster to challenge monarchy as a principle. They arrived to safeguard precedent, protect local interests, and ensure that extraordinary demands were justified, limited, and consistent with custom. Consent was the key mechanism through which Parliament exercised influence. Taxation, especially, required parliamentary approval. This was not initially framed as a right seized from the crown, but as a practical necessity. Kings needed revenue to govern and defend the realm. Parliament provided legitimacy to those demands by allowing representatives to debate and assent on behalf of those who would pay. Once granted, taxes were more likely to be collected efficiently and without unrest. This process depended heavily on trust. When trust existed, parliamentary sessions were often brief and cooperative. The Crown requested funds. Parliament raised concerns. Concessions were made quietly. Precedents were cited. Agreements were reached. The machinery of governance continued to function without drawing attention to itself. No one involved believed they were redefining authority. They believed they were preserving it. Precedent mattered deeply within this culture. Parliamentary privilege did not arise from abstract theory, but from accumulated practice. Rights were asserted not as innovations, but as restorations. When members resisted certain demands, they did so by appealing to earlier reigns, earlier statutes, earlier understandings of what had been acceptable. This backward-looking orientation restrained radicalism. Change was justified only insofar as it could be presented as continuity. The language used within Parliament reflected this mindset. Speeches emphasized loyalty. Petitions affirmed obedience, even while requesting redress. Criticism was often indirect, framed as concern for the king's honor or the welfare of the realm, rather than as challenge to authority. This rhetorical caution was not merely strategic. It reflected genuine belief that the Crown and Parliament shared responsibility for preserving order. Crucially, Parliament did not meet regularly by default. It was summoned by the King, convened for specific purposes, and dissolved when those purposes were fulfilled. This arrangement reinforced the understanding that Parliament existed to serve governance, not to supervise it continuously. Its power lay not in permanence, but in necessity. When summoned, it mattered. When dismissed, it receded into local life. Members returned to their counties and towns, carrying the authority of decisions made collectively. They explained taxation, enforced statutes, and mediated between central authority and local communities. In this way, Parliament functioned as a bridge rather than a barrier. It translated royal policy into terms that could be accepted and implemented beyond Westminster. This system functioned best when its underlying assumptions remained unspoken. As long as King and Parliament shared an understanding of their respective roles, friction could be absorbed without consequence. Disagreement did not threaten the structure. It reaffirmed it by demonstrating that grievances could be addressed within accepted forms. The early 17th century inherited this system intact. When James VI of Scotland became James I of England in 1603, he encountered a parliament that expected cooperation rather than confrontation. His belief in royal authority did not initially disturb this relationship because it aligned broadly with existing assumptions. Parliament did not contest the divine basis of kingship. It sought clarity about how authority would be exercised in practice. Tensions arose not from ideological opposition, but from accumulation of strain. Inflation, war expenditure, and religious uncertainty increased the demands placed upon governance. Each parliamentary session carried greater weight. Requests for revenue became more frequent. Debates grew longer. Yet even as disagreement intensified, both sides continued to speak the language of partnership. What made this period fragile was not the presence of conflict, but the absence of shared silence. Where trust had once operated implicitly, it now required articulation. Motives were questioned more openly. Assurances had to be repeated. Each appeal to precedent revealed how contested memory had become. The system still functioned, but it did so with increasing effort. Parliament's resistance, when it occurred, was defensive rather than transformative. Members did not seek to overthrow kingship. They sought to preserve a balance they believed was under threat. Their appeals to consent were framed as protection against disorder, not as instruments of reform. They feared arbitrary rule, not because they desired sovereignty, but because unpredictability endangered the local stability they were responsible for maintaining. This orientation explains why Parliament did not move swiftly or decisively, even as tensions mounted. Radical solutions were resisted because they lacked precedent. Caution was interpreted as prudence. Delay felt safer than innovation. This way, Parliament's conservatism mirrored that of the Crown. Both institutions valued continuity more than resolution. By the time Charles most ascended the throne in 1625, Parliament remained what it had long been, a customary partner in governance, not an oppositional body seeking transformation. Its members believed that cooperation was both possible and necessary. They assumed that shared history would continue to guide decision-making. The tragedy that followed did not arise because Parliament sought revolution. It arose because the conditions that had sustained unspoken trust no longer held. As assumptions hardened and communication strained, the very mechanisms designed to preserve stability became sites of uncertainty. Before conflict became visible, Parliament still operated within inherited limits. It debated, petitioned, and consented according to forms that had served England for generations. It did not yet recognize itself as an alternative source of authority. It recognized itself as a custodian of continuity, attempting to uphold a partnership whose foundations were quietly shifting beneath it. In this way, Parliament entered the crisis of the 1640s not as a revolutionary force, but as an institution struggling to perform a familiar role in an unfamiliar environment. Its caution, its reliance on precedent, and its belief in cooperation delayed rupture even as pressure accumulated. The war that would follow did not begin in defiance. It began in the slow realization that shared understanding, once sufficient, could no longer be taken for granted. In the generations before the English Civil War, religion in England functioned less as a source of argument than as a framework for stability. The Church of England did not present itself as a movement seeking transformation or purity. It existed as a settlement, carefully shaped to contain division rather than provoke it. And its greatest achievement lay not in inspiring fervor, but in preventing chaos. This settlement had emerged from a century of upheaval that England had no desire to repeat. The violent oscillations of the 16th century, from the break with Rome under Henry VIII through Protestant reform under Edward VI, Catholic restoration under Mary I, and the re-establishment of Protestantism under Elizabeth I, had left deep scars. Memory of these changes lingered not only in official chronicles, but in family stories. Abandoned shrines, altered churches, and quiet habits learned under one reign and abandoned under the next. By the early 17th century, stability itself had become a religious value. The Church of England represented an attempt to hold the nation together by moderating belief rather than sharpening it. Its doctrine affirmed Protestant theology, yet its structure retained elements of older tradition. Bishops remained, cathedrals endured, liturgy followed a prescribed form that emphasized order, rhythm, and uniformity. This was not accidental. The Church was designed to feel familiar enough to avoid alienation, while clear enough to prevent fragmentation. Parish life stood at the center of this system. The parish was not simply an ecclesiastical boundary, it was a social unit that shaped identity from birth to death. Baptisms, marriages, and burials marked individual lives within a shared communal framework. Sundays gathered the population together, not only to hear scripture, but to see one another, to reaffirm belonging, and to inhabit a shared sense of time. Ritual repetition played a crucial role in this process. Services followed the same structure week after week. Prayers were spoken aloud in unison. Psalms were recited in rhythms that encouraged participation rather than interpretation. This repetition did not aim to provoke emotional intensity. It aimed to create familiarity. Faith was learned through habit as much as conviction. The Book of Common Prayer embodied this approach. Its language was deliberate, measured, and inclusive. By prescribing what was said and when it was said, the Church reduced variation that might invite disagreement. Worship became a collective act rather than an individual expression. The meaning of belief was reinforced through shared words rather than private reflection. Sermons reinforced this emphasis on order. Preachers were expected to instruct rather than inflame. Themes of obedience, patience, humility, and acceptance of one's station were common. Authority was presented as divinely sanctioned. Disorder was framed as dangerous not only to the soul, but to society itself. These messages resonated because they aligned with lived experience. Communities that remembered upheaval valued calm over intensity. Communal worship also reinforced social hierarchy. Seating arrangements reflected status. Local elites occupied prominent positions, while laborers stood or sat behind. This arrangement did not necessarily breed resentment. It mirrored the wider structure of society and reinforced the belief that order was natural and necessary. Religion, in this sense, did not challenge hierarchy. It sanctified it. The memory of religious violence loomed quietly over these practices. Although the fires of Marian persecution and the suppression of Catholic worship lay decades in the past, their consequences were still visible. Families remembered relatives lost, livelihoods disrupted, and communities divided. These memories discouraged enthusiasm for doctrinal extremes. Stability felt fragile, and religion was expected to protect it. This fear of disorder shaped how difference was tolerated. Private belief varied more widely than public practice. Some parishioners leaned toward more ceremonial worship, others toward simpler forms, but outward conformity mattered more than inward conviction. The Church did not demand uniformity of thought. It demanded uniformity of practice. This distinction allowed a broad range of belief to coexist under a single institutional roof. The Crown played a critical role in maintaining this balance. The monarch stood as supreme governor of the Church of England, linking religious authority to political stability. This arrangement reinforced the idea that unity in worship supported unity in governance. Challenges to ecclesiastical order, therefore, carried implications beyond theology. They threatened the cohesion of the realm. This connection between church and state was widely accepted. Few questioned the principle itself. The experience of past upheaval had demonstrated that religious division could undermine authority and invite violence. By aligning the church with the crown, England sought to ensure that faith reinforced obedience rather than eroded it. At the local level, the parish priest embodied this alignment. He was both spiritual guide and community figure, often responsible for record keeping, moral discipline, and mediation of disputes. His authority rested not on charisma, but on position. He represented continuity. His presence linked the community to the wider structures of church and state. Festivals and holy days further reinforced communal bonds. The calendar shaped social life as much as spiritual observance. These occasions provided rhythm, relief, and reassurance. They reminded communities that time moved forward according to a shared pattern. Even disagreement could be absorbed within this structure, because the structure itself remained intact. By the early 17th century, this system had succeeded in one crucial respect. It made religion feel settled. While theological debates continued among clergy and scholars, everyday religious life felt predictable. For most people, faith was not a battlefield. It was a backdrop. This sense of settlement mattered because it shaped expectations. Religion was not supposed to disrupt. It was supposed to stabilize. When anxieties began to surface about ceremonial changes, about perceived Catholic influence, about preaching that strayed from moderation, those anxieties were powerful precisely because they threatened something deeply valued. Yet, before these concerns hardened, religion in England still functioned primarily as social glue. It bound communities together through shared practice, shared memory, and shared fear of disorder. It taught people how to live within a hierarchy they believed had preserved them through turmoil. The Church of England did not eliminate difference. It managed it. Its strength lay in its ability to contain tension without demanding resolution. As long as this containment held, religion supported continuity rather than conflict. The tragedy that would follow did not arise because religion was inherently divisive. It arose because pressures accumulated that strained the compromise beyond its capacity. Before that strain became visible, faith in England remained what it had long been, a stabilizing force rooted in habit, memory, and the shared desire to avoid the chaos of the past. In this way, religion prepared the ground not for rebellion, but for resistance to change. It encouraged obedience, patience, and conformity, values that preserve peace even as underlying conditions shifted. The Church of England stood as a reminder of what England feared losing most, a sense of order that felt fragile, precisely because it had been hard won. Charles I inherited a crown weighted less by ambition than by expectation. From the beginning of his life, order was not something he sought to impose upon the world. It was something he believed already existed and required preservation. This belief shaped his temperament, his conduct, and ultimately his decisions as king. To understand his reign is not to search for tyranny or enlightenment, but to trace the consequences of a worldview formed within rigidity, reverence, and an unyielding sense of duty. Born in 1600, the second son of James VI of Scotland and I of England, Charles entered the world without anticipation of rule. His elder brother Henry embodied the qualities expected of a future monarch: confident, athletic, outwardly commanding. Charles, by contrast, was physically fragile in childhood, slow to speak, hesitant in movement, and often overshadowed. These early conditions fostered not entitlement, but introspection. He learned to observe rather than dominate, to internalize standards rather than perform them. When Henry died suddenly in 1612, Charles's path changed without preparation. He was required to assume a role he had not been shaped to expect, yet the transition did not loosen his sense of responsibility. Instead, it intensified it. The crown appeared not as opportunity, but as burden. Kingship was something to be born correctly, not adapted creatively. This distinction would define his reign. His education reinforced this orientation. Charles absorbed the political theology of his father, particularly the belief that monarchy derived its authority from divine order rather than human arrangement. James had articulated this doctrine explicitly, arguing that kings were accountable to God alone, and that resistance to lawful authority invited disorder. For Charles, these ideas were not rhetorical tools. They formed a moral framework. Obedience was not merely practical, it was righteous. This belief did not make Charles careless. The contrary, it made him meticulous. He valued formality because form conveyed meaning. Ceremony mattered because it reflected hierarchy. Precision in conduct signaled legitimacy. He approached kingship as a sacred trust that demanded restraint and seriousness, not improvisation. Where others might have sought flexibility, Charles sought correctness. This seriousness extended into his personal life. He was reserved, private, and uncomfortable with public spontaneity. Unlike rulers who cultivated popularity, Charles did not instinctively seek affection. He assumed loyalty would follow order, not charm. Emotional distance did not strike him as dangerous. It struck him as appropriate. Authority, in his understanding, was diminished by familiarity. In marriage, this pattern persisted. His union with Henrietta Maria of France in 1625 brought companionship, but also reinforced his inward orientation. She was Catholic in a Protestant realm, a fact that required careful management rather than ideological confrontation. Charles approached this challenge not through accommodation, but through containment. He believed boundaries, once established, could preserve harmony without public negotiation. When Charles ascended the throne in 1625, he inherited not a kingdom in revolt, but a system under strain. England faced financial pressure, unresolved religious anxiety, and the demands of continental war. None of these conditions were unique, yet their accumulation required choices that tested inherited assumptions. Charles did not perceive himself as innovating. He believed he was preserving order against erosion. His relationship with Parliament illustrates this logic. Charles did not view Parliament as illegitimate or hostile by nature. He understood it as a customary institution that functioned properly when it assisted the crown. Cooperation was expected, but on terms that preserved hierarchy. When Parliament questioned royal policy, Charles did not interpret this as partnership. He interpreted it as deviation from role. This interpretation arose from insecurity rather than arrogance. Charles lacked confidence in negotiation because negotiation implied uncertainty. To yield ground risked undermining the clarity of authority upon which he believed stability depended. Concession did not appear to him as prudence. It appeared as weakness that might invite further challenge. Financial conflicts sharpened this tension. War required revenue, and revenue required parliamentary consent. Parliament sought assurances regarding policy, religion, and the use of funds. Charles sought obedience grounded in trust. When consent was delayed or conditioned, he experienced it not as disagreement, but as obstruction. The breakdown was not sudden. It unfolded through misunderstanding, rooted in incompatible expectations. Charles's response was not immediate repression, it was withdrawal. When parliamentary cooperation failed to meet his standards of obedience, he chose to govern without it. This decision, beginning in 1629, was not conceived as extraordinary in his own mind. He saw it as lawful, temporary, and necessary. Kings had ruled without parliament before. He believed he could do so again while maintaining order. The personal rule that followed was marked by administrative continuity rather than chaos. Governance continued. Courts functioned. Law was enforced. The absence of parliament did not produce immediate collapse. This apparent success reinforced Charles's belief that authority, when exercised correctly, did not require constant negotiation. Yet, beneath this surface stability, trust eroded. Charles governed according to principle, but principle did not address perception. His insistence on correctness appeared to others as inflexibility. His belief in obedience appeared as disregard for counsel. His reserve was interpreted not as seriousness, but as distance. These interpretations mattered because authority in England had long depended on shared assumption rather than force. Religion intensified these tensions. Charles favored ceremonial worship that emphasized continuity with the early church. He supported reforms associated with Archbishop William Laud that sought uniformity and reverence. To Charles, these changes represented order restored. To many subjects, they signaled threat. The memory of Catholic dominance made symbolism dangerous. Charles did not dismiss these fears. He simply did not prioritize them above coherence. This was not indifference. It was hierarchy. In Charles's worldview, unity of worship safeguarded unity of state. Allowing variation invited fragmentation. He believed that firm enforcement of religious conformity would prevent disorder before it emerged. Resistance to these policies struck him as misunderstanding rather than malice. The problem lay in scale. Local discomfort became national anxiety. What Charles experienced as correction was experienced by others as imposition. Yet, he did not recalibrate. To do so would have required re-examining the assumptions that defined his identity as king. That re-examination felt more dangerous than persistence. When crises emerged beyond England, particularly in Scotland, in the late 1630s, Charles confronted the limits of his approach. His attempt to impose English religious forms upon a different ecclesiastical tradition provoked resistance he did not anticipate. He believed order, once asserted, would be accepted. Instead, it revealed how fragile consent had become. Faced with military necessity, Charles recalled Parliament in 1640. He did so reluctantly, not because he doubted its authority, but because he believed necessity justified cooperation without redefining hierarchy. Parliament, however, returned with accumulated grievance. Years of silence had transformed caution into resolve. Charles struggled to adapt. He continued to interpret opposition through the lens of duty. He believed that firmness would restore order. Compromise still appeared as abdication. As Parliament pressed for guarantees, Charles pressed for obedience. Each move hardened positions without revealing intent to destroy the system itself. Throughout this period, Charles did not act from cruelty or ambition. He acted from conviction. He believed kingship was a sacred office entrusted to him personally. To fail in that trust by yielding authority felt worse than conflict. This moral framework narrowed his options. Each choice reinforced the same logic until alternatives disappeared. By the early 1640s, the gap between Charles's understanding of kingship and the expectations of many subjects had become structural. It could not be resolved through persuasion alone. Yet Charles remained consistent. He did not reinvent himself. He did not abandon principle for expedience. That consistency would later be interpreted as obstinacy. In its own time, it was experienced as integrity. Charles III was not a man of revolution. He was a man shaped by continuity who could not imagine authority existing in altered form. His tragedy was not blindness to danger, but fidelity to an order that no longer functioned as he believed it should. His decisions emerged logically from his worldview, a worldview formed by inheritance, belief, and a profound sense of obligation. When conflict finally became unavoidable, it did not mark a sudden transformation in Charles's character. It marked the exhaustion of a system that required shared assumptions he could no longer rely upon. He did not fail because he sought too much power. He failed because he could not relinquish the meaning of power he had been taught to preserve. In this way, Charles I stands not as an aberration in English history, but as a product of it. His reign reveals how deeply order had been internalized, and how difficult it was to adjust when the structures that sustained that order began to fracture. The war that followed would not arise from his desire to dominate, but from his inability to imagine kingship as anything other than what it had always been. By the early 17th century, the English crown confronted a reality that kingship alone could not resolve. Authority, however divinely framed, required resources to function. Government was not sustained by symbolism or obedience alone. It depended upon money, and money moved through systems that demanded cooperation rather than command. This tension, quiet at first, would become one of the most persistent pressures shaping the breakdown of trust between Crown and Parliament. The financial structure of the English state had developed in an earlier age, when the responsibilities of government were narrower and the costs of warfare more limited. Royal income rested primarily on traditional sources: rents from crown lands, feudal dues, customs revenues, and occasional extraordinary levies approved by Parliament. These streams had once been sufficient. By the late 16th and early 17th centuries, they no longer were. Inflation had altered the value of money across Europe. Prices rose steadily while fixed revenues lagged behind. The Crown's ordinary income, tied to older valuations, failed to keep pace with the cost of administration, defense, and diplomacy. England's ambitions, though cautious, still required participation in continental politics, naval protection of trade routes, and maintenance of internal order. Each of these demands carried expense that could not be postponed indefinitely. War amplified these pressures. Although England was not continuously at war, Involvement in conflicts abroad, particularly those connected to the wider struggles of the 30 Years' War after 1618, placed strain on royal finances. Supporting allies, maintaining fleets, and preparing defences required funds far beyond ordinary income. Even when campaigns were limited or indirect, readiness itself was costly. Administration also expanded. Governance in a more complex society demanded officials, courts, record-keeping, and enforcement mechanisms that had grown steadily over time. Justice, taxation, and regulation all required personnel. The Crown could not retreat from these obligations without weakening authority. Yet, meeting them required revenue that traditional sources could not reliably supply. Taxation thus became unavoidable. Extraordinary taxation, however, carried political and cultural implications. In England, taxes beyond customary dues required parliamentary consent. This was not an ideological concession. It was a practical recognition that taxation touched local communities directly, and that compliance depended on legitimacy. Parliament provided that legitimacy by allowing representatives to debate, approve, and explain financial demands. This system functioned effectively when trust existed. The Crown presented its needs. Parliament scrutinised requests, sought assurances, and granted funds. In return, Parliament expected transparency regarding how money would be used and respect for precedent governing its collection. These expectations were not revolutionary. They were procedural, rooted in custom rather than challenge. The difficulty arose when necessity increased faster than trust. Under James III, who ruled from 1603 to 1625, financial strain was already apparent. His court expenditures, diplomatic ambitions, and efforts to secure peace strained resources. Parliament resisted not because it denied the Crown's needs, but because it feared unchecked expenditure would undermine stability. Negotiations were frequent and often frustrating, yet they remained within familiar forms. When Charles I ascended the throne in 1625, he inherited these pressures in intensified form. England faced renewed conflict with Spain and France, both of which demanded funding. Charles's sense of duty compelled him to act decisively, yet Parliament's willingness to supply funds remained conditional. Members sought accountability, fearing that money granted without limitation would enable policies they did not fully support, particularly in matters of religion and foreign alliance. Parliamentary resistance during this period did not take the form of outright refusal. Instead, it manifested through delay, conditional grants, and insistence upon redress of grievances. Subsidies were voted in smaller amounts. Terms were attached. This behavior was procedural, consistent with precedent, and intended to preserve leverage rather than provoke confrontation. Charles interpreted these actions differently. From his perspective, the Crown's needs were urgent and legitimate. Parliamentary hesitation appeared as obstruction at a moment of necessity. The logic that had once sustained cooperation now produced frustration. Each side believed it was acting responsibly within inherited roles, yet their expectations no longer aligned. Faced with financial shortfall, Charles explored alternative means of raising revenue. Some were drawn from historical precedent, such as the collection of tonnage and poundage, customs duties traditionally granted to monarchs for life. Parliament, however, delayed formal approval, seeking to use consent as a means of influence. Charles continued to collect these duties regardless, believing tradition justified the practice. Parliament viewed this as circumvention rather than continuity. Other measures followed. Forced loans were levied in 1626 and 1627, compelling subjects to contribute funds without parliamentary approval. These loans were framed as temporary and necessary, yet they stirred unease. Resistance did not arise primarily from refusal to support the crown, but from concern that precedent was being stretched beyond safety. If necessity justified bypassing consent, the boundary protecting customary rights weakened. The Petition of Right in 1628 reflected this anxiety. Parliament did not deny the Crown's authority or its need for funds. Instead, it sought reaffirmation of established principles governing taxation and imprisonment. The petition was not revolutionary in intent. It appealed to history, insisting that extraordinary measures remain constrained by law. Charles assented, seeing the concession as compatible with his understanding of kingship, yet mutual suspicion persisted. When parliamentary cooperation continued to disappoint, Charles chose a different path. In 1629, he dissolved Parliament and embarked upon what later became known as the personal rule. This decision was driven not by hostility toward Parliament as an institution, but by belief that governance could continue without constant negotiation. If Parliament would not supply funds promptly, alternative mechanisms would be employed. During the years from 1629 to 1640, Charles relied on a variety of revenue-raising devices rooted in legal precedent. Ship money, traditionally levied on coastal towns during wartime, was extended inland and collected during peacetime, beginning in the mid-1630s. From Charles's perspective, this was a lawful adaptation to changing defensive needs. England required naval readiness, and the cost had to be met. To many subjects, however, the expansion of ship money signaled a troubling shift. Although the sums involved were often modest, the principle mattered. Taxation without parliamentary consent, even when justified by security, unsettled assumptions that had governed cooperation for generations. Legal challenges, such as John Hampden's refusal to pay in 1637, reflected concern rather than rebellion. The courts ultimately upheld the Crown's position, reinforcing Charles's belief in the legitimacy of his actions. Yet, legitimacy in law did not guarantee legitimacy in trust. Revenue collection succeeded in sustaining administration, but it did so at the cost of goodwill. The machinery of government continued to function, but the sense of partnership weakened. Subjects complied, yet compliance increasingly felt coerced rather than cooperative. This erosion mattered when circumstances changed. The outbreak of conflict in Scotland in the late 1630s, arising from religious policy, demanded military response. War required money on a scale that alternative revenues could not supply. Charles faced necessity once more, and in 1640 he recalled Parliament. The Parliament that assembled was shaped by a decade of accumulated grievance. Members did not arrive seeking revolution. They arrived seeking safeguards. Financial pressure had exposed the limits of governance without consent. Parliament's insistence on addressing grievances before granting funds reflected procedural logic, not defiance. They believed stability depended on restoring trust through reaffirmed boundaries. Charles, however, still viewed necessity as overriding delay. Each refusal to grant immediate funds deepened his sense that cooperation had failed. Each insistence on conditions deepened Parliament's conviction that unchecked authority threatened order. The conflict that emerged was not born of ideology, but of incompatible interpretations of responsibility. Money thus became the medium through which authority was tested. Financial pressure forced decisions that revealed the fragility of shared assumptions. Neither side sought rupture. Both believed they were preserving England's stability. Yet necessity narrowed options, and procedure hardened into principle. By the early 1640s, financial conflict had ceased to be merely administrative. It had become structural. The Crown required resources it could no longer obtain without consent. Parliament demanded assurances it no longer trusted the Crown to honour. The mechanisms that once translated necessity into cooperation now translated it into suspicion. The tragedy of this period lies in its inevitability. Governance required money. Money required consent. Consent required trust. When trust eroded, each link in this chain strained the next. The English Civil War would not begin over ideology alone. It would begin because the practical requirements of rule could no longer be met within the inherited framework that had once sustained them. In this way, financial necessity did not cause conflict directly. It exposed it. The pressures of governance forced institutions to reveal assumptions they could no longer share. What had once been routine negotiation became a test of authority itself, and once authority was tested repeatedly without resolution, the path toward confrontation narrowed, not by intent, but by structure. When Charles I dismissed Parliament in March 1629, he did not believe he was ending a partnership. He believed he was preserving governance itself. The decision emerged not from confidence, but from exhaustion, and from a conviction that the machinery of rule could continue only if it were relieved, at least temporarily, from confrontation. To later generations, this period would be named the personal rule. To Charles, it was a necessary pause, a means of survival within a system he still believed could be restored once strain had eased. The context mattered. By 1629, Charles had endured 4 turbulent parliamentary sessions since his accession in 1625. Each had followed a similar pattern. The Crown requested funds. Parliament delayed, attached conditions, or pressed grievances. Negotiations hardened. Mutual suspicion deepened. From Charles' perspective, Parliament no longer functioned as a cooperative body assisting governance. It had become an arena where authority itself questioned through procedure. Yet Charles did not interpret this shift as constitutional evolution. He interpreted it as disorder. His understanding of kingship left little room for sustained negotiation under pressure. He believed that when institutions ceased to perform their expected roles, responsibility fell upon the Crown to maintain continuity by other lawful means. Dissolving Parliament, therefore, appeared not as abandonment of tradition, but as its protection. There was precedent for such a course. English monarchs had governed without Parliament before, sometimes for extended periods. The Crown possessed prerogative powers that allowed administration, justice, and revenue collection to continue in the absence of parliamentary sessions. Charles believed he could draw upon these powers while preserving order, and that doing so would remind Parliament of its proper function when it was eventually recalled. In this sense, the personal rule was conceived as temporary, corrective, and lawful. It was not accompanied by dramatic declarations or ideological justification. Parliament was dismissed quietly. Government continued. Courts remained open. Officials carried out their duties. For many subjects, daily life changed little at first. Surface stability defined the early years of the 1630s. The realm was at peace. Foreign entanglements were limited. Trade resumed its rhythms. Justice was administered through established channels. The absence of Parliament did not produce immediate disruption, and this apparent normality reinforced Charles's belief that governance could function without constant consent. Administration during this period became more centralized and efficient in certain respects. Charles relied heavily on trusted advisors, among them Thomas Wentworth and Archbishop William Laud, men who shared his commitment to order and coherence. Policy was shaped within a narrower circle, allowing decisions to be implemented without prolonged debate. From the Crown's perspective, this efficiency confirmed the wisdom of withdrawal. Revenue collection, though constrained, proved sufficient to sustain administration. Charles employed a range of legal mechanisms, grounded in precedent to raise funds, among them ship money, forest fines, and monopolies regulated by the courts. These measures were framed as lawful extensions of royal authority rather than innovations. Compliance was widespread and resistance limited. To many subjects, the continuation of order was reassuring. The memory of instability made calm preferable to confrontation. As long as taxes remained bearable and justice predictable, there was little incentive for open opposition. England appeared, on the surface, to have entered a period of quiet consolidation. Yet, beneath this stability, trust eroded steadily. The absence of Parliament altered expectations. Subjects who had relied upon their representatives to voice concerns now lacked that outlet. Grievances did not disappear. They accumulated privately. Compliance continued, but it increasingly felt compelled rather than consensual. The difference was subtle, but significant. Ship money exemplified this shift. Traditionally levied on coastal towns during wartime, it was extended inland and collected during peacetime, beginning in 1634, and applied nationally by 1635. From Charles's viewpoint, this adaptation responded to England's defensive needs in an uncertain international environment. Naval readiness required funding, and the law provided a mechanism. For many subjects, however, the expansion of ship money crossed an invisible boundary. Though the sums demanded were often modest, the principle troubled those who valued parliamentary consent as a safeguard. Legal challenges emerged not from widespread rebellion, but from concern. That precedent was being stretched beyond recognition. The case of John Hampden in 1637, which upheld the Crown's authority by a narrow margin, clarified legality without restoring confidence. Religion further complicated the atmosphere. Charles and Laud pursued a program of ecclesiastical uniformity designed to reinforce order and reverence. Churches were reorganized. Ceremonial practices were emphasized. Discipline was enforced. To the Crown, these measures restored dignity and coherence. To others, they appeared to threaten the delicate religious settlement that had preserved peace. Again, resistance was limited. Most parishes complied. Services continued. Yet unease grew. Religious policy, like taxation, lacked the mediating presence of Parliament. Decisions that might once have been debated now arrived as directives. Obedience continued, but understanding diminished. What made this erosion dangerous was its invisibility. Charles governed a realm that appeared orderly, but whose consent was thinning. He mistook compliance for approval. The machinery of authority continued to operate, yet its foundations weakened. The king himself did not perceive resentment as hostility. He interpreted silence as acceptance. His worldview did not readily accommodate passive resistance. As long as laws were obeyed and revenues collected, he believed order endured. The possibility that loyalty required participation rather than mere compliance remained distant. This gap between perception and reality widened as the decade progressed. Those who opposed royal policy did so cautiously, framing their objections in legal or religious terms rather than political ones. They waited rather than acted. The absence of Parliament delayed confrontation, but it also removed mechanisms through which tension could be released. The turning point came not from England itself, but from Scotland. Charles's attempt to impose religious uniformity there in 1637 provoked open resistance. The resulting bishops' wars, beginning in 1639, demanded military response. War required resources beyond what prerogative finance could supply. Once again, necessity narrowed options. In April 1640, Charles recalled Parliament, ending 11 years of personal rule. The Parliament that assembled reflected the accumulated experience of the 1630s. Members arrived not as revolutionaries, but as men shaped by a decade without representation. Grievances, long unspoken, were now articulated with urgency. The personal rule had succeeded in maintaining order. It had failed in preserving trust. This failure was not the result of cruelty or incompetence. It arose from structural limits. Governance without consent could function only under conditions of peace and restraint. When pressure returned, the absence of shared understanding became decisive. Charles had believed that by withdrawing from Parliament, he could preserve authority until cooperation resumed. Instead, withdrawal transformed expectations. Parliament, once a partner, became a memory of lost balance. When it returned, it did so altered by absence. The years from 1629 to 1640 therefore occupy a central place in the story of the English Civil War. They demonstrate how stability can coexist with decay, and how order maintained by compliance alone cannot endure strain. Charles I did not abandon governance during the personal rule. He practiced it according to his deepest convictions. Those convictions, shaped by belief in hierarchy, duty, and lawful authority, produced a decade of calm that masked a profound transformation. Trust, once implicit, became conditional. Consent, once assumed, became necessary to articulate. When the system was forced back into negotiation, it no longer recognized itself. The personal rule did not cause war. It made war possible by delaying confrontation until alternatives had narrowed. What appeared as survival strategy became, over time, a quiet redefinition of authority. When that redefinition was finally challenged, the structures that might have absorbed conflict had already weakened. By the mid-1630s, religion in England no longer functioned solely as a stabilizing inheritance. It remained embedded in daily life, parish routine and communal memory, yet its meaning had begun to shift. What once reassured now unsettled. The change did not occur suddenly, nor did it announce itself as conflict. It emerged gradually through altered emphasis, accumulated memory, and the growing sense that familiar forms no longer carried the same guarantees they once had. The fear that shaped this period was not abstract theology. It was historical memory. England had lived through religious transformation before, and the consequences had been severe. The decades following the break with Rome in the 1530s had taught a lasting lesson that changes in worship were rarely confined to churches. They carried political consequence, social disruption, and at times, violence. By the early 17th century, these experiences were no longer recent, but they were not distant enough to be forgotten. They survived in stories, habits, and instinctive caution. The Church of England had been constructed to prevent the return of such instability. Its settlement under Elizabeth II was deliberately broad, allowing outward conformity to contain inward variation. That settlement depended on restraint. It assumed that no faction would push the boundaries of worship so far that the compromise itself appeared threatened. By the reign of Charles I, this assumption began to weaken. Charles's understanding of religion was shaped by his understanding of order. He believed that worship should reflect hierarchy, reverence, and continuity with the early church. To him, beauty, ceremony, and discipline reinforced authority rather than undermining it. Disorder in worship appeared dangerous, not because of doctrinal impurity, but because it mirrored disorder in society. Uniformity, therefore, was not an aesthetic preference. It was a safeguard. This belief found expression through the policies associated with William Laud, appointed Archbishop of Canterbury in 1633. Laud did not seek theological innovation. He sought conformity. Churches were rearranged to emphasize the altar. Ritual gestures were standardized. Clergy were disciplined for deviation. From the Crown's perspective, these measures restored dignity and coherence to worship. For many subjects, however, the emphasis felt unsettling. The Church of England had long balanced Protestant doctrine with restrained ceremony. Laud's reforms appeared to tip that balance. They revived symbols and practices that, though not Catholic in doctrine, resembled forms England had deliberately set aside. The fear was not that England had become Catholic. The fear was that it might be moving without consent towards something it had once rejected at great cost. These anxieties were sharpened by the presence of Henrietta Maria, Charles's Catholic queen. Her religion was known and officially tolerated, yet it carried symbolic weight. Her household included Catholic clergy. Her chapels operated visibly within a Protestant court. Though Charles did not allow Catholicism to shape policy openly, perception mattered more than intention. To a population trained by history to read symbols carefully, the coexistence of ceremonial reform and Catholic presence felt suggestive. Suspicion did not erupt immediately. Parish life continued. Services were held. Most clergy complied with new directives, yet conversations changed. Sermons were listened to more carefully. Gestures were noticed. Furniture arrangements became topics of quiet concern. What had once been routine now invited interpretation. Religious language provided a vocabulary for expressing unease that extended beyond theology. Complaints about ceremony often masked anxiety about authority. Questions about worship became questions about governance. If the Crown could alter religious practice without consultation, what else might it alter? Faith became a means of articulating broader concern about the direction of rule. This transformation occurred gradually. In the early 1630s, resistance was isolated and cautious. Legal challenges focused on procedure rather than belief. Clergy who objected framed their arguments in terms of custom and conscience. Lay opposition expressed itself through silence, compliance without enthusiasm, or private correspondence. England was not divided into camps. It was unsettled. The Crown misread this silence. Charles interpreted obedience as acceptance. His worldview did not encourage attention to passive resistance. As long as laws were enforced and worship conducted according to instruction, he believed stability endured. Yet the absence of open protest did not indicate reassurance. It indicated caution. The memory of earlier religious conflict shaped this caution. England had learned that speaking too loudly about faith could invite scrutiny, punishment, or worse. Moderation became a survival strategy. Dissent learned to disguise itself as concern for order rather than challenge to belief. This made anxiety harder to detect and easier to underestimate. By the mid-1630s, political events began to interact with religious suspicion in ways that deepened unease. Charles's extension of ship money nationwide in 1635 and its legal affirmation in 1637 reinforced the perception that authority was expanding without mediation. These developments were not religious in nature, yet they were interpreted through a religious lens. If law and worship could be reshaped without consent, then the safeguards of the settlement appeared fragile. The trial of John Hampden in 1637, though focused on taxation, became symbolically linked to wider concerns. The narrowness of the court's decision suggested division, even within authority. Confidence in restraint weakened. Authority appeared increasingly dependent on enforcement rather than trust. Religion absorbed these signals. Sermons warning against disorder now sounded ambiguous. Calls for obedience were heard as demands rather than reassurance. Ritual uniformity felt imposed rather than shared. What had once unified began to divide quietly, not along clear doctrinal lines, but along lines of confidence and suspicion. The Scottish crisis exposed these tensions fully. In 1637, Charles attempted to introduce a new prayer book into Scotland, reflecting his commitment to uniform worship. Scotland's ecclesiastical tradition differed significantly from England's, and resistance was immediate. The reaction shocked Charles, not because opposition existed, but because it escalated so rapidly. What he viewed as correction was received as threat. To English observers, the Scottish resistance confirmed anxieties they had not yet voiced openly. If religious policy could provoke rebellion elsewhere, what might it produce at home? The bishops' wars of 1639 and 1640 transformed abstract fear into concrete concern. Religion was no longer merely a matter of parish arrangement. It had become a catalyst for conflict. Yet even at this stage, English anxiety did not crystallize into rebellion. The response remained cautious, procedural, and framed within inherited language. When Parliament was recalled in 1640, religious grievances featured prominently, not as demands for revolution, but as calls for restoration of balance. Members spoke of innovation, popery, and superstition, yet these terms served as shorthand for deeper fears about unchecked authority. The language of religion proved effective because it carried moral weight without requiring explicit political defiance. To accuse policy of popish tendency was not merely to question doctrine, it was to question legitimacy. England's Protestant identity had been forged through struggle. To appear to undermine it was to appear to threaten the nation itself. Charles struggled to grasp this transformation. He did not believe his religious policy endangered Protestantism. He believed it strengthened reverence and discipline. The gap between intention and perception widened. Each effort to enforce uniformity confirmed suspicion among those who feared it. By 1640, religious anxiety had hardened into expectation. Many no longer asked whether policy would change. They assumed it would continue unless restrained. Faith ceased to function purely as stabilizer. It became a lens through which authority was judged. This shift did not arise from exaggeration or mass hysteria. It arose from cumulative experience. Small changes, unmediated authority, symbolic gestures, and historical memory combined to reshape interpretation. The fear was not that England had become Catholic. It was that the safeguards preventing such transformation no longer felt secure. Religious anxiety, once diffuse, now shaped political alignment. It informed trust, guided suspicion, and justified resistance framed as preservation. Yet, even as it hardened, it retained its conservative character. Those who feared change did not seek upheaval. They sought restoration of a balance they believed had been disturbed. The tragedy lay in the mutual incomprehension this produced. Charles believed he was defending order through discipline. His subjects increasingly believed order required restraint upon authority. Both spoke the language of stability. Both appealed to history. Yet their assumptions no longer overlapped. As England moved toward the early 1640s, religion had ceased to be merely a shared inheritance. It had become a measure of trust. Once that trust fractured, even familiar forms could no longer reassure. The ground beneath stability had shifted quietly, and by the time the shift became visible, suspicion had already taken root. By the late summer of 1641, England stood in a condition that few would yet have named as war, but which no longer resembled peace. The transition was neither sudden nor openly declared. It unfolded through caution, layered upon caution, through measures taken defensively that were interpreted offensively by those who observed them from the other side. What moved the kingdom toward armed conflict was not an appetite for violence, but a growing conviction, held simultaneously by opposing groups, that restraint itself had become dangerous. The recall of Parliament in November 1640 marked the first decisive shift. The assembly that gathered, later known as the Long Parliament, did not arrive with a plan for revolution. Its members came shaped by the experiences of the 1630s, years in which authority had operated without consultation and grievances had accumulated without release. They believed they were restoring balance, not redefining sovereignty. Their actions were framed as a corrective, aimed at ensuring that governance returned to forms that could command trust. In the early months of 1641, Parliament moved deliberately. Long-standing grievances were addressed through legislation rather than proclamation. The execution of Thomas Wentworth, Earl of Strafford, in May 1641 was justified not as vengeance, but as necessity. Strafford's belief in strong, centralized authority appeared to many as a threat to constitutional order. Removing him was presented as an act of preservation, an attempt to prevent future tyranny rather than punish past service. The tone remained grave rather than triumphant. The king, Charles I, accepted these measures with visible reluctance. His assent to the execution of Strafford, given under immense pressure, wounded him deeply. He did not see it as compromise, but as coercion. Yet even then, he did not imagine civil war as the outcome. He believed that once grievances were addressed, loyalty would resume its accustomed form. The idea that Parliament might permanently alter the nature of authority remained distant. Throughout 1641, both sides continued to speak the language of loyalty. Parliament insisted that it acted in the king's name and for his true interest. Charles insisted that he sought harmony and obedience rather than domination. The conflict, at this stage, was not between king and kingdom, but between competing interpretations of how the kingdom could be kept intact. Events in Ireland sharpened these tensions. In October 1641, rebellion broke out among Irish Catholics, accompanied by reports, often exaggerated but widely believed, of massacres against Protestant settlers. Fear spread rapidly across England. The question of how to respond exposed a deep fracture. An army would be required to suppress the rebellion, yet whoever controlled that army would possess force unprecedented within the kingdom. Parliament feared that an army under royal control might be turned against domestic opposition. Charles feared that an army controlled by Parliament would undermine the Crown's authority permanently. Neither fear was abstract. Both drew upon recent experience. Each side believed that allowing the other control of military force risked the destruction of England's constitutional balance. This dilemma transformed mistrust into strategy. Parliament sought legal mechanisms to secure influence over military appointments. Charles resisted, believing such concessions would render kingship hollow. Each move was justified as defensive. Each response was interpreted as escalation. The winter of 1641 to 1642 deepened uncertainty. Public demonstrations increased in London. Pamphlets circulated widely, shaping opinion beyond traditional channels. Language hardened, though actions remained restrained. Parliament issued the Grand Remonstrance in November 1641, a lengthy document cataloguing grievances. It was not a call to arms. It was an attempt to define the narrative of recent years, to persuade both king and country that reform was essential to survival. Charles received the remonstrance as a challenge to his authority. He did not reject its content entirely, but he rejected its tone. The publication of grievances to the public suggested that Parliament no longer trusted private negotiation. Authority, once managed quietly, was now being contested openly. This change in method mattered as much as the demands themselves. In January 1642, Charles took a step that would later be seen as irrevocable. He entered the House of Commons with armed guards to arrest 5 members accused of treason. The attempt failed. The members had already fled. The symbolic impact, however, was profound. To Parliament, the presence of armed force within its chamber confirmed fears of coercion. To the King, the failure demonstrated the erosion of obedience he believed essential to order. Charles left London soon afterward, not in flight, but in recognition that the city no longer offered safety or neutrality. Parliament retained control of the capital, the navy, and much of the kingdom's administrative apparatus. The separation of king and parliament into distinct geographic and political spheres altered the nature of the dispute. Negotiation became more difficult as physical distance reinforced psychological division. Still, war did not begin immediately. Throughout the spring and summer of 1642, both sides prepared while insisting they sought peace. Petitions were exchanged. Declarations were issued. Each claimed to defend the laws and liberties of England. Each accused the other of threatening them. These statements were not propaganda in the modern sense. They reflected genuine belief that legitimacy depended on appearing restrained. Militias were organized locally, justified as protective measures. Arms were gathered cautiously. Loyalty varied by region, shaped by local leadership, religious orientation, and personal allegiance. Communities hesitated. Families debated. No clear line yet divided the kingdom. What existed instead was a growing sense that neutrality would soon be impossible. The language of precaution dominated this period. Parliament claimed it must prepare in case the king resorted to force. The king claimed he must prepare in case Parliament usurped authority. Neither side trusted the other to remain unarmed. Preparation thus became a form of compulsion. To refrain from readiness appeared reckless. The final step came not through a single decision, but through the exhaustion of alternatives. In August 1642, Charles raised his standard at Nottingham, signaling that he would defend his authority by force if necessary. Even then, the act was framed as reluctant. He spoke of being compelled by circumstance, of seeking protection rather than conquest. Parliament responded in kind, organizing its own forces, while continuing to insist that it fought for the king's true interest. The symmetry of justification revealed the tragedy of the moment. Both sides believed they were preserving England from collapse. Both believed delay favored disaster. Neither believed itself the aggressor. War, when it came, arrived not as culmination of desire, but as consequence of fear. Each side had misjudged the other's intentions while overestimating the danger of inaction. Precaution hardened into commitment. Commitment narrowed choices. Once force was organized, restraint appeared less rational than resolve. The English Civil War did not begin because England wanted bloodshed. It began because trust had eroded to the point where shared authority could no longer function. Armed conflict emerged as the final mechanism through which unresolved questions would be tested. This understanding matters because it explains the character of the war that followed. It was not fought as a foreign invasion or ideological crusade. It was fought as a struggle over legitimacy within a shared political culture. Neighbors faced one another not as enemies of England, but as defenders of different versions of it. The drift into war was slow, hesitant, and marked by regret. Its inevitability lay not in human passion, but in structural failure. Once institutions designed to mediate disagreement lost credibility, force became the only remaining language both sides believed the other would understand. By the time the first shots were fired in the late summer of 1642, England had already changed. The war did not shatter peace. It revealed that peace, as it had been known, could no longer be sustained. When fighting began in earnest in the autumn of 1642, it did not resemble the wars England remembered from chronicles or sermons. There was no clean division between professional armies, no settled understanding of what victory would mean, and no widespread certainty that violence would last. What unfolded instead was a confused and hesitant struggle, shaped as much by misunderstanding as by intent, and experienced most acutely by those who had not chosen it. The first engagements, beginning with the confrontation at Edgehill on 23 October 1642, carried none of the clarity later generations would impose upon them. Men marched under banners that claimed loyalty to the same crown. Prayers were offered on both sides for the same kingdom. Many soldiers had never traveled far from home before they took the field. They fought less from conviction than from obligation, loyalty to local leaders, fear of reprisal, or belief that service would be brief. Communities divided unevenly. Allegiance did not follow simple lines of class or geography. Families found themselves split, brothers serving opposing forces, neighbors avoiding one another out of caution rather than hatred. In market towns and villages, the arrival of armed men unsettled routines that had shaped life for generations. Quartering troops strained resources. Livestock was requisitioned. Churches were used for storage or shelter. Familiar spaces acquired unfamiliar purposes. Confusion extended beyond the battlefield. News traveled slowly and unreliably. Rumors moved faster than facts, often exaggerating victories or atrocities. Each side feared the intentions of the other more than its strength. Suspicion hardened not through ideology, but through uncertainty. Silence was interpreted as threat, delay as deception. The early armies themselves reflected this instability. They were assembled hastily, composed of volunteers, pressed men, and local militias. Training was uneven. Discipline varied widely. Commanders learned as they led. Orders were misunderstood or ignored, not out of defiance, but inexperience. Battles often dissolved into chaos long before their outcome could be understood. At Edgehill, neither side achieved decisive success. The fighting was fierce, personal, and disorienting. Cavalry charges scattered formations. Infantry lines faltered. Smoke obscured vision. Men fought without clear sense of where they stood within a larger plan. When darkness fell, many did not know whether they had won or lost. The absence of resolution mirrored the uncertainty of the war itself. The emotional cost of these encounters was immediate. Those who survived returned home altered, carrying memories they could not easily articulate. The reality of killing, often at close range, weighed heavily on men who had expected duty, not carnage. Communities struggled to reconcile familiar faces with unfamiliar actions. Mourning became complicated by ambiguity. Loss did not feel heroic. It felt bewildering. Civilians bore much of this burden. Armies moved through the countryside, leaving disruption in their wake. Harvests were interrupted. Trade declined. Fear reshaped daily behavior. People learned to watch the roads, to listen for distant movement, to weigh every interaction for risk. Neutrality became increasingly difficult to maintain, not because of pressure to choose sides, but because presence itself was interpreted as alignment. Religious life reflected this strain. Sermons shifted in tone, grappling with suffering rather than order. Prayer became more urgent, yet less certain. The familiar language of obedience and stability struggled to account for violence enacted by those who claimed to defend the same faith. The war unsettled belief not through doctrinal challenge, but through experience. As months passed, the expectation of a short conflict faded. The winter of 1642 and 1643 brought no resolution. Skirmishes continued, towns changed hands, sieges disrupted regional life. Each engagement reinforced the sense that the war was not moving toward clarity, but deepening confusion. The absence of decisive victory prolonged uncertainty, allowing fear and resentment to grow. This confusion shaped behavior. Brutality increased, not from cruelty alone, but from frustration. Soldiers uncertain of purpose sought reassurance through force. Civilians, unsure whom to trust, withdrew or complied outwardly, while harboring private anxiety. Authority fragmented. Local leaders exercised power in the absence of clear direction, sometimes protecting communities, sometimes exploiting them. Yet even amid this disorder, reluctance persisted. Many continued to hope for settlement. Negotiations were attempted intermittently, reflecting the shared belief that war was a means, not an end. These efforts failed not because peace was rejected, but because trust had eroded too far. Each side doubted the other's willingness to honor agreement. The early phase of the English Civil War thus unfolded not as a clash of certainties, but as a crisis of comprehension. People struggled to understand how disagreement had become violence, and what violence was meant to resolve. The war did not yet possess a narrative that could contain it. It existed as a series of disruptions, accumulating without direction. This lack of clarity mattered. It shaped the war's moral and emotional landscape. Without a clear sense of purpose, suffering felt arbitrary. Loss lacked justification. Communities endured not with resolve, but with endurance, born of necessity. The war entered homes and fields before it entered ideology. In this early confusion lay the seeds of transformation. As uncertainty persisted, positions would harden. Experience would replace assumption. What began as reluctant defense would become committed struggle. Yet in these first months, the dominant feeling was not hatred, but disorientation. The English Civil War did not begin with conviction. It began with confusion, with ordinary people caught between competing claims of loyalty, struggling to navigate a world in which familiar structures no longer provided guidance. The early battles revealed not the strength of either cause, but the fragility of the peace that had once held them together. As the war lengthened beyond its first uncertain year, survival itself began to reshape belief. What had started in 1642 as a reluctant resort to arms increasingly became a condition of life that demanded explanation, justification, and endurance. The longer the conflict persisted, the less space remained for moderation, not because moderation was rejected in principle, but because it could no longer offer protection. In the early stages of the war, many on both sides had assumed that force would clarify positions and compel settlement. A decisive engagement, a show of strength, or the removal of a few influential figures might restore balance. By 1643, this expectation had faded. Campaigns continued without resolution. Towns were taken and retaken. Armies wintered, regrouped, and returned to the field. The war did not exhaust itself. It settled in. This persistence altered perception. When conflict becomes continuous, neutrality begins to appear not as prudence, but as vulnerability. Communities learned that hesitation invited suspicion from both sides. To delay choosing allegiance risked being treated as hostile by whichever force arrived next. Survival increasingly required commitment, even when conviction remained uncertain. Belief adapted accordingly. Positions hardened, not because people sought extremity, but because clarity offered safety. To be firmly identified with one cause reduced ambiguity, Ambiguity, once a shield, became a liability. As the war spread across regions, allegiance was no longer an abstract question. It determined who protected you, who requisitioned your goods, and who judged your loyalty. This pressure reshaped political thought. Early parliamentary rhetoric had emphasized preservation of the ancient constitution and defense of the king's true authority. Royalist declarations had emphasized obedience, tradition, and the restoration of order. Over time, these shared references lost their unifying power. Experience intruded. Those who suffered under military occupation, taxation, or religious enforcement began to interpret events through outcomes rather than intention. Religion absorbed this shift. Sermons grew more urgent and less restrained. Clergy who had once emphasized patience and obedience now confronted congregations marked by loss and fear. The language of trial and testing gained prominence. Suffering demanded meaning. Survival demanded explanation. Faith, once a stabilizing inheritance, became a framework for endurance under strain. On the parliamentary side, this process encouraged greater ideological clarity. As royalist forces continued to fight in the king's name, many concluded that compromise could not succeed while the crown retained independent military power. Moderation, in this view, prolonged danger rather than reducing it. The idea that peace could be restored without structural change began to feel increasingly unrealistic. The same dynamic operated among royalists. Continued resistance by Parliament appeared to confirm fears that authority itself was under threat. Each concession seemed to invite further demand. Loyalty hardened into principle. The war was no longer about correcting misgovernment. It was about preserving hierarchy against erosion. Survival demanded discipline. Armies that endured learned to organize more effectively, to enforce order among their ranks, and to sustain morale through belief. This process favored those willing to impose structure without hesitation. Commanders who acted decisively gained influence. Those who hesitated lost authority. Over time, the war rewarded clarity over compromise. Civilians experienced this transformation intimately. The need to protect families, property, and worship reshaped priorities. Communities aligned themselves with forces they believed could offer stability, even if that stability was harsh. Ideological nuance mattered less than predictability. Survival narrowed moral horizons. By 1644, the war had entered a new phase. The formation of the new model army in 1645 represented not only military reform, but ideological consolidation. This force embodied lessons learned through years of struggle. Discipline, merit, and shared purpose replaced local loyalty and improvisation. The army did not merely fight, it believed. This belief was shaped by experience. Soldiers who had endured hardship, loss, and uncertainty developed a conviction that their cause was righteous because it had sustained them. Survival itself became evidence of legitimacy. The longer they fought, the harder it became to imagine retreat. Compromise now appeared as betrayal of sacrifice already made. Moderation suffered accordingly. Those who continued to advocate settlement were increasingly sidelined. Their proposals seemed detached from the realities of war. Calls for negotiation raised suspicion. Why negotiate now, after so much blood had been shed, unless one doubted the cause itself? Survival transformed caution into liability. This radicalization did not occur solely through argument. It occurred through repetition. Each campaign reinforced the same lesson. Delay prolonged danger. Half measures invited disaster. Ideological clarity offered coherence in a fractured world. Over time, these lessons hardened into conviction. The transformation was not uniform. Doubt persisted. Grief complicated certainty. Yet the overall direction was unmistakable. As the war consumed years rather than months, it demanded a level of commitment incompatible with moderation. Those who survived did so by adapting, and adaptation favored those willing to redefine purpose. By the mid-1640s, the war was no longer simply a contest between king and parliament. It had become a struggle over the meaning of authority itself. Survival had reshaped belief. What once felt unthinkable began to feel necessary. The idea that the king might be constrained permanently, or even removed, entered discussion not as aspiration, but as consequence. This shift did not arise from abstract theory. It arose from lived experience. Men who had marched, fought, and buried comrades found it difficult to return to a world governed by the assumptions that had led to war. The past no longer offered guidance. The future demanded resolution. In this way, prolonged conflict transformed ideology through necessity. Survival became teacher and judge. It rewarded certainty, punished hesitation, and narrowed the space for reconciliation. By the time decisive victories arrived, positions had hardened beyond recognition. The English Civil War radicalized not because its participants sought extremity, but because endurance required it. Survival changed what people believed was possible, acceptable, and justifiable. The war did not merely reflect ideological division. It produced it, slowly and inexorably, as the cost of living through uncertainty forced belief to adapt to the demands of continued struggle. By the middle years of the English Civil War, it had become clear that endurance alone would not determine the outcome. The conflict had exposed the limitations of improvised forces, raised through local loyalty, personal allegiance, and inherited rank. Survival had hardened belief, but belief without structure had reached its limits. Out of this recognition emerged an institution that did more than change how the war was fought. It changed how power itself was understood. This institution was the new model army. Its creation in early 1645 did not arise from abstract theory or ideological ambition. It emerged from accumulated failure. Parliamentary forces had fought bravely since 1642, yet inconsistency plagued them. Commanders were appointed through social standing rather than competence. Units answered to regional authorities whose priorities conflicted. Discipline varied, morale fluctuated, and coordination faltered at critical moments. Each campaign revealed the same problem. Parliament could raise men, but it could not reliably direct them. By late 1644, the need for reform was no longer disputable. The war had dragged on for over 2 years. Resources were strained. Public patience thinned. Victory could no longer be postponed by hope of negotiation. Parliament faced a choice: continue fighting with structures inherited from the past, or reshape those structures to meet the demands of prolonged conflict. The self-denying ordinance, passed in April 1645, reflected this turning point. It required members of Parliament to relinquish military commands, separating political authority from battlefield leadership. The intent was not ideological purity, it was efficiency. War demanded professional direction free from divided loyalties. Authority had to be concentrated where it could act decisively. Out of this decision came the new model army, formally established in early 1645. It was national rather than regional, centrally funded, uniformly trained, and hierarchically organized. For the first time, Parliament possessed a standing force designed not merely to resist, but to prevail. The army's structure embodied lessons learned through survival. Officers were appointed primarily on merit rather than birth. This did not abolish social hierarchy entirely, but it loosened it. Competence mattered. Experience mattered. Authority was earned through performance rather than inherited entitlement. This principle alone marked a profound departure from traditional English military practice. Discipline formed the army's foundation. Soldiers were regularly paid, reducing reliance on plunder. Codes of conduct governed behavior towards civilians. Enforcement was strict. Order within the ranks was treated as essential to legitimacy. An army that claimed to fight for law and liberty could not survive through disorder. This discipline distinguished the new model army from earlier forces, whose presence often burdened the communities they occupied. Faith played a central role in sustaining this discipline. The army was not secular in outlook. It was deeply religious, shaped by Puritan belief that interpreted events through providence. Prayer, preaching, and scripture formed part of daily routine. This shared faith provided cohesion that transcended locality. Soldiers did not fight merely as men under orders. They fought as participants in a cause they believed had been tested and sustained by survival itself. Yet this faith was not imposed uniformly from above. The army tolerated a degree of religious diversity within a broadly Protestant framework. What mattered was sincerity and discipline rather than strict conformity. This flexibility allowed conviction to flourish without fragmenting unity. Belief reinforced order rather than undermining it. Organization extended beyond the battlefield. The new model army developed administrative systems capable of sustaining prolonged operations. Supply, logistics, recruitment, and communication were coordinated centrally. The army became a functioning institution rather than a temporary gathering of men. Its permanence altered expectations. War was no longer an interruption. It was a condition requiring management. The immediate military impact was evident. At Naseby, in June 1645, the new model army demonstrated its effectiveness decisively. The victory did more than defeat royalist forces. It shattered confidence in the king's ability to prevail militarily. From that point forward, the strategic balance shifted irreversibly. Yet the deeper significance of the new model army lay not in victory alone, but in what victory made possible. An army capable of sustained action required justification. Soldiers who endured hardship, enforced discipline, and achieved success developed a collective identity. Survival reinforced belief. Belief demanded meaning. Meaning began to extend beyond obedience to immediate command. As the war continued, the army became increasingly self-aware. Its members debated the purpose of their sacrifice. They reflected on the political settlement that might follow victory. The same discipline that enabled military success enabled collective discussion. Soldiers did not merely fight, they thought. This development unsettled traditional authority. The army remained loyal to Parliament in form, yet its cohesion and confidence granted it leverage. It could not easily be dismissed. It could not be ignored. Its presence altered negotiation. Power now rested not only in institutions, but in those who could enforce outcomes. This shift became apparent in the late 1640s. As Parliament debated settlement with the defeated king, divisions emerged between civilian leadership and military reality. Many within the army believed that compromise would undo the sacrifices made. Their perspective did not arise from ambition, it arose from survival. They had endured because they believed the cause justified endurance. A settlement that restored old structures appeared to negate that belief. The army's discipline, once purely military, now carried political consequence. Its organization allowed it to act collectively. Its faith provided moral confidence. Its merit-based leadership fostered trust. Together, These elements transformed it into a political force without precedent in English history. This transformation did not mean the army sought to rule. It meant that authority could no longer operate without accounting for it. Decisions taken in Westminster had to consider reaction in the ranks. The balance of power had shifted from inherited institutions alone to those capable of sustaining order through force and belief. The new model army thus represented a culmination of the war's internal logic. Prolonged conflict had demanded clarity. Clarity had demanded discipline. Discipline had produced cohesion. Cohesion had produced power. By 1646, when organized resistance to Parliament largely collapsed, the army remained intact. Its existence posed questions that peace alone could not answer. What role should such a force play in a nation accustomed to temporary armies? How could authority be restored without dismissing those who had secured it? These questions revealed the army's deeper significance. It had altered expectations about governance, obedience, and legitimacy. Authority now required effectiveness as well as tradition. Survival had become a credential. The new model army did not overthrow the old order by design. It emerged because the old order could no longer fight effectively. In doing so, it revealed that power in a time of crisis flows toward those who can organize endurance. Its legacy extended far beyond the battlefield. It reshaped the relationship between force and authority, belief and obedience, structure and legitimacy. England would never again assume that military power could be raised and dismissed without consequence. When the king surrendered himself to the Scottish army in May 1646, the act did not feel like the end of a war. It felt like the suspension of meaning. For a society that had been shaped for generations by the assumption that kingship stood above contingency, the sight of a captured monarch unsettled more than political calculation. It disturbed the emotional and psychological architecture through which authority had been understood. Charles I was no longer a distant figure issuing proclamations. He was physically present, moved from place to place, negotiated over, guarded. The crown remained intact in symbol, yet its bearer was subject to constraint. This contradiction reverberated across England. Many who had opposed the king's policies had not imagined this outcome. They had argued against misgovernment, not against kingship embodied in a vulnerable man. The shock lay not only in defeat, but in proximity. To hold a king was to confront the fragility of an institution that had always appeared abstract and enduring. Authority, once sustained by distance and ritual, now existed in confinement. This proximity forced a reckoning. What did obedience mean when the king could be held, questioned, and moved at will? Initially, uncertainty prevailed. No clear precedent guided action. Charles was neither deposed nor free. Negotiations resumed, framed by the hope that settlement remained possible. Many believed that restoration of order required reconciliation rather than punishment. The assumption persisted that kingship, even weakened, must be preserved to prevent further fragmentation. Charles himself clung to this belief. Throughout 1646 and 1647, he negotiated with multiple factions, seeking terms that would restore his authority while conceding as little as possible. He believed division among his opponents would compel compromise. His strategy reflected long-held assumptions that authority, once acknowledged, would eventually reassert itself. These negotiations prolonged uncertainty. Parliament debated, the army waited, and the country watched. The king's presence became a focal point for unresolved questions. Each delay intensified tension. Each failed agreement eroded patience. The hope that the war's end would naturally restore stability faded. The army's role grew decisive during this period. Soldiers who had endured years of hardship viewed settlement differently. Their experience had altered their expectations. Compromise that reinstated old structures appeared to threaten the meaning of their sacrifice. When Charles was taken into army custody in June 1647, it marked another shift, not toward clarity, but toward inevitability. The king's subsequent escape attempt in November 1647 further transformed perception. To many, it confirmed that negotiation alone could not resolve the conflict. Trust diminished sharply. What had been interpreted as patience now appeared as delay. The idea that Charles would never fully accept the limits imposed upon him began to take hold. By late 1648, after renewed conflict during the Second Civil War, the atmosphere had changed decisively. The resurgence of fighting convinced many that unresolved authority invited continual instability. The war no longer felt containable. Survival demanded finality. The decision to put the king on trial emerged from this context, not as ideological ambition, but as procedural necessity. There was no established mechanism for judging a reigning monarch. Law had never been required to address such a situation, yet the absence of procedure now appeared more dangerous than its creation. The High Court of Justice was established in January 1649. Its formation was cautious, formal, and deliberate. Language was measured. Authority was asserted through structure rather than spectacle. Those involved understood the gravity of what they were undertaking. This was not a moment of triumph. It was a moment of containment. The charge against Charles framed his actions as betrayal of trust rather than personal wrongdoing. He was accused of waging war against his own people. The language reflected an attempt to reconcile legal reasoning with unprecedented circumstance. Kingship was not denied outright. It was reinterpreted through responsibility. Charles rejected the court's authority. His refusal was consistent with his worldview. To recognize the court would be to concede that kingship derived from human judgment rather than divine order. His stance reinforced the impasse. Authority confronted authority, each grounded in incompatible assumptions. The trial proceeded nonetheless. Witnesses testified, documents were read, formalities were observed. The ritual of law attempted to impose order upon a moment that resisted resolution. Observers recognized that procedure itself was being tested. The outcome was uncertain, not because the decision was undecided, but because its implications were immeasurable. When judgment was delivered on 27 January 1649, it carried weight beyond its words. The sentence did not declare the end of monarchy. It declared the accountability of a king. The distinction mattered deeply to those who sought to preserve some continuity within rupture. The execution that followed days later would mark an irreversible threshold, but the trial itself had already altered England's understanding of authority. By subjecting the king to judgment, the nation crossed a line it could not uncross. Yet this crossing was undertaken slowly, heavily, and without celebration. Throughout this period, uncertainty remained dominant. Many feared what would follow more than what had occurred. The trial did not resolve the war's meaning. It exposed its cost. Authority, once unquestioned, had been examined and found incompatible with survival as it had been understood. The capture and judgment of Charles I did not arise from hatred or zeal. They arose from exhaustion, mistrust, and the collapse of shared assumptions. The process reflected an attempt to restore order through definition when tradition no longer sufficed. In this moment, England confronted the consequences of a war fought not to destroy kingship, but to preserve stability. That preservation had failed. The trial represented an effort to impose finality where continuity had broken. The gravity of the act lay in its loneliness. No earlier example could justify it. No future outcome could yet explain it. Those who carried it forward did so aware that they were stepping beyond inheritance into uncertainty. The king's capture transformed the war from conflict into reckoning. His trial transformed reckoning into decision. What followed would reshape England's political and moral landscape, but the judgment itself stood as a testament to a society struggling to reconcile belief with survival, and law with an order that had ceased to function as it once had. On the morning of 30th January 1649, England did not gather itself for spectacle. It entered a silence that few had imagined possible. The execution of Charles I was not accompanied by celebration, nor did it unfold as a theatrical climax to years of war. Instead, it arrived as a moment heavy with restraint, shaped by awareness that something fundamental was ending, even if no one could yet define what would follow. The day itself was cold. Winter pressed upon London with a physical weight that mirrored the psychological atmosphere surrounding Whitehall. The king was brought from St. James's Palace to the banqueting house, a building long associated with royal ceremony and continuity. Its classical architecture, designed to project order and permanence, now framed an act that contradicted the assumptions it embodied. The setting mattered. This was not an improvised space. It was a place built to affirm monarchy, now witnessing its fracture. Those present did not behave as a crowd awaiting triumph. Witnesses later remarked on the stillness. Guards maintained order, but there was no roar of approval, no surge of collective emotion. Many watched in silence, uncertain of how to respond. Others turned away. The absence of noise carried meaning. It reflected recognition that this act could not be easily absorbed into existing categories of victory or justice. Charles himself remained composed. His behavior did not signal defiance so much as adherence to the identity he had always inhabited. He dressed carefully, choosing extra clothing to prevent shivering in the cold, aware that any sign of weakness might be misread. His concern was not for survival, which he no longer expected, but for interpretation. Even in his final moments, he understood kingship as something performed as well as possessed. When he spoke, his words were measured. He did not plead for mercy. He did not attempt to rouse sympathy. He framed his death within the language that had shaped his reign, emphasizing order, conscience, and duty. To those who listened, his speech underscored the rupture more sharply than any gesture could have. A king, speaking of obedience as he prepared to be executed, revealed how completely the shared framework of authority had collapsed. The act itself was swift. There was no prolonged ritual, no drawn-out display. The executioner performed his task efficiently. When it was done, the silence deepened rather than broke. Observers did not cheer. Many stood stunned. Some wept quietly. Others struggled to reconcile what they had seen with what they had believed possible. What ended that day was not monarchy alone. It was the set of assumptions that had structured English political life for centuries. The belief that the king stood beyond judgment, accountable only to God, no longer held. The idea that authority derived its stability from inheritance rather than consent had been irrevocably tested and found insufficient under strain. Equally significant was what did not end. Order did not dissolve into chaos. The sky did not darken. Society did not collapse immediately. Life continued. Markets reopened. People returned to their homes. This continuity complicated interpretation. If the king could be executed and the world continue, then the relationship between authority and stability required rethinking. For many, this realization was deeply unsettling. The execution forced acknowledgement that the old framework had depended as much on belief as on law or force. Once belief fractured, the framework could not sustain itself. The act did not create this fracture. It exposed it fully. The absence of celebration reflected awareness of this exposure. Those who had supported the king's trial did not experience triumph. They experienced finality. The execution closed off paths that had already narrowed. It foreclosed reconciliation with the past, as it had been known. The act could not be undone, and its consequences could not be predicted with certainty. In the days that followed, England moved cautiously. Proclamations were issued. Governance continued under new forms. Yet beneath these surface adjustments lay profound uncertainty. Without a king, the source of legitimacy had to be articulated rather than assumed. Authority could no longer rest on inheritance alone. It required justification. This need reshaped political language. Terms such as Commonwealth and sovereignty gained prominence, not because they were new, but because they now had to carry weight previously borne by tradition. The execution forced concepts into the open that had long remained implicit. It demanded definition where inheritance had once sufficed. The rupture extended beyond politics into memory and identity. For generations, English history had been narrated through reigns. Time itself had been organized around monarchs. With Charles's death, that narrative structure fractured. What followed could not simply be the next chapter. It required a different grammar. Religious interpretation also struggled to keep pace. Some viewed the execution as divine judgment. Others saw it as human presumption. Sermons reflected uncertainty rather than clarity. The language of providence, once reassuring, now felt ambiguous. Faith did not dissolve, but it became more contested, more inward, less certain of its public meaning. The silence of the execution thus echoed far beyond Whitehall. It marked the end of an era in which authority could rely on shared assumption rather than explicit consent. It revealed that order maintained through tradition alone could not withstand prolonged pressure without adaptation. Importantly, this rupture was not experienced as liberation. Even those who believed the execution necessary understood its cost. They recognized that England had crossed a threshold without a clear path forward. The act removed a symbol of unity without immediately replacing it with an equally compelling alternative. In this sense, the execution represented exhaustion rather than ambition. It was the product of years of conflict in which compromise had failed and trust had eroded. It did not resolve the war's deeper questions. It acknowledged that the old answers no longer functioned. What followed would be shaped by this acknowledgement. The Commonwealth that emerged sought to ground authority in different principles, yet it inherited the same pressures that had undermined the monarchy. The execution had removed a person, not the structural challenges of governance. The day's silence thus signaled more than mourning or restraint. It marked recognition of uncertainty as a permanent condition. England had entered a period in which legitimacy would be debated rather than assumed, enforced rather than inherited. For those who witnessed the execution, the memory lingered not as spectacle, but as absence. An absence of certainty, an absence of familiar order, an absence of the figure through whom authority had once been understood. The rupture of 30 January 1649 did not announce a clear beginning. It closed a long chapter without providing its successor. In doing so, it forced England to confront the reality that stability, once broken, could not be restored simply by removing a single element. It required reimagining the foundations upon which authority rested. That reimagining would shape the years to come, but on that cold winter day, what mattered most was what had ended. The execution of Charles I marked the conclusion of a belief that kingship was inseparable from order. The silence that followed testified to the weight of that realization and to the understanding that England had crossed into a future defined not by continuity, but by consequence. In the months following the execution of Charles I in January 1649, England did not enter a period of clarity. It entered a period of management. The monarchy had been removed, but the problems that had strained it into collapse remained. The Commonwealth that followed was not born of celebration or confidence. It emerged from exhaustion, from the belief that order had to be imposed deliberately because it could no longer be assumed. The abolition of kingship and the House of Lords in early 1649 created a political vacuum that ideology alone could not fill. Parliament declared England a Commonwealth, governed in the name of the people, yet the meaning of that declaration remained uncertain. Power had been redistributed, but legitimacy had not yet been secured. Authority now required constant justification, enforcement, and explanation. Those who guided the new regime believed deeply that they were preserving England from further instability. The Commonwealth was framed as a corrective, a system that would prevent the return of arbitrary rule and religious coercion. Its leaders spoke the language of liberty, law, and godly reform. Yet the conditions under which they governed limited how those ideals could be expressed. England in 1649 was weary. Years of war had drained resources, fractured trust, and hardened expectations. The population did not demand experimentation. It demanded predictability. The Commonwealth inherited a nation accustomed to authority, even if that authority had been contested. To govern effectively, it had to replace familiar structures quickly, not dismantle them slowly. This urgency shaped policy. Power was concentrated within a reduced parliament, often referred to as the rump parliament, whose legitimacy rested more on survival than consent. Elections were postponed, debate narrowed. Decisions were taken by a small group, burdened by responsibility and haunted by precedent. Idealism persisted, but it operated within constraints, imposed by fatigue. Control became the primary mechanism of governance. The army remained intact, not as a temporary necessity, but as a stabilizing force. Its presence ensured compliance, discouraged rebellion, and provided the security without which policy could not function. This reliance on military power was not accidental. It reflected recognition that authority, without enforcement, had failed once already. Yet this reliance troubled many who had fought to limit coercion. The Commonwealth promised liberty, yet governed through surveillance, censorship, and force. Publications were monitored, public dissent was restrained. Religious toleration expanded in theory, but remained limited in practice. Order was prioritized over expression. This tension between idealism and governance defined the period. The Commonwealth sought to embody principles born of resistance, while administering a state shaped by necessity. It aimed to secure freedoms through regulation, to prevent disorder through restriction. Each decision reflected compromise rather than confidence. Economic pressure intensified this strain. War debts remained unpaid. Trade required protection. Taxation continued at levels comparable to wartime. The population, having endured years of sacrifice, experienced little relief. Governance felt continuous rather than renewed. For many, the absence of a king did not translate into visible improvement. Foreign policy further constrained choice. England faced hostility from royalist exiles, European powers, and colonial unrest. The Commonwealth needed to project strength to survive diplomatically. Naval expansion, military campaigns in Ireland and Scotland, and defensive trade routes demanded resources and discipline. Idealism yielded to pragmatism. Within Parliament, divisions deepened. Some pressed for further reform, envisioning a godly commonwealth grounded in moral renewal. Others feared that continued experimentation would invite chaos. The memory of war discouraged risk. Stability, even imperfect stability, appeared preferable to renewed conflict. Exhaustion permeated decision-making. Leaders governed not with enthusiasm, but with vigilance. Each policy aimed to prevent relapse rather than inspire transformation. The Commonwealth functioned as a holding structure, designed to contain pressure rather than resolve it. This exhaustion was not merely physical, it was psychological. The act of executing a king had imposed a burden that could not be easily shed. Those responsible carried the weight of irreversibility. Their governance reflected caution shaped by awareness that failure might invite restoration, revenge, or renewed war. By the early 1650s, the Commonwealth had secured control, but not confidence. Order existed, yet it required constant reinforcement. Ideals survived in language, but practice remained constrained by necessity. The regime governed effectively enough to endure, but not convincingly enough to inspire broad loyalty. In this sense, the Commonwealth represented an attempt to impose order through control rather than consensus. It was a regime born not of victory, but of survival. Its limitations did not arise from lack of principle, but from the conditions inherited from prolonged conflict. The Commonwealth did not resolve England's crisis of authority. It managed it. Its leaders understood that governance after rupture required restraint, vigilance, and endurance. Idealism collided with reality, and reality prevailed, not because ideals were abandoned, but because exhaustion left little space for their full expression. By the early 1650s, the English Revolution had reached a point where ideals could no longer operate without structure. Into this narrowing space stepped Oliver Cromwell, not as an architect of power seeking dominion, but as a figure shaped by contradiction, compelled forward by circumstances he neither fully controlled nor entirely resisted. Cromwell's rise did not follow the trajectory of a conventional revolutionary leader. He had not entered the civil wars with a vision of remaking England's constitutional order. In 1642, he was a provincial gentleman, driven by conviction rather than ambition, shaped by religious intensity and a belief that providence guided events. His early military success owed less to personal aspiration than to competence revealed under pressure. Each responsibility he assumed came not through design, but through the collapse of alternatives. This pattern continued after the war. The execution of Charles V in 1649 had removed the focal point of authority, but it had not replaced it with a stable system. The Commonwealth that followed depended increasingly on the army, and the army, in turn, depended on Cromwell. His authority emerged not from office alone, but from trust forged in survival. Soldiers followed him because he had endured with them, not because he promised reward or advancement. Yet this trust created its own dilemma. The revolutionary origins of the new regime had emphasized limits on authority, resistance to arbitrary power, and suspicion of centralized control. Cromwell shared these values in principle. He believed deeply in godly rule, constrained by conscience. At the same time, he confronted a reality in which dispersed authority repeatedly failed to govern effectively. Parliament, particularly the rump parliament that remained after 1648, struggled to translate revolutionary legitimacy into functioning administration. Debates dragged, reforms stalled, elections were postponed. The gap between ideological aspiration and practical governance widened. Cromwell observed this not with impatience alone, but with concern. Disorder, in his experience, invited violence, not liberty. April 1653, Cromwell dissolved the Rump Parliament by force. The act shocked contemporaries, not because it revealed ambition, but because it violated expectation. Parliament had been the institutional heart of resistance to monarchy. To see it dismissed by the army's leading general suggested that the revolution had begun to consume its own foundations. Cromwell did not celebrate this moment. His recorded words reveal frustration rather than triumph. He believed Parliament had failed in its duty to reform the nation and secure peace. Dissolution, in his mind, was not an assertion of supremacy, but a reluctant intervention to prevent stagnation from becoming collapse. The experiment that followed, the nominated Assembly of 1653, reflected Cromwell's continued hesitation. He did not immediately assume formal power. Instead, he supported a body selected for perceived godliness and reformist intent. This assembly, later known as Barebones Parliament, embodied revolutionary idealism, stripped of traditional authority. Its failure was swift. Internal division, impractical proposals, and loss of confidence made its dissolution inevitable within months. This failure clarified the limits of idealism, unanchored to structure. Cromwell now faced a narrowed field of choice. Either authority would be reassembled deliberately, or it would fragment further, inviting renewed conflict. In December 1653, he accepted the title of Lord Protector under the instrument of government, England's first written constitution. The Protectorate marked a return to centralized authority, though in altered form. Power was consolidated in a single executive, supported by councils and parliaments. The language of monarchy was avoided, yet many of its functions reappeared. Stability required hierarchy. Governance required decisiveness. The revolution, having dismantled one center of power, found itself compelled to construct another. Cromwell's role within this system was deeply conflicted. He resisted the trappings of kingship, even refusing the crown when offered in 1657. His reluctance was sincere. He feared that assuming the title would betray the principles for which the war had been fought. Yet his actions increasingly resembled those of the monarchs he had opposed. He dissolved parliaments that challenged him. He ruled through military districts when civilian authority faltered. He relied on force to maintain order. This was not hypocrisy in the simple sense. It was consequence. The structures that had supported authority in earlier generations had been dismantled. New ones had not yet secured legitimacy. Cromwell governed within this void, constrained by necessity. Each exercise of power sought to prevent collapse rather than assert dominance. Religion continued to shape his decisions. Cromwell believed England had been spared for a purpose, and that disorder endangered that purpose. His tolerance toward Protestant sects reflected commitment to conscience, yet limits remained. Stability could not be sacrificed to unlimited expression. Control was justified as protection. Foreign policy reinforced these pressures. England's position in Europe remained precarious. War with the Dutch in 1652, 1654, and later conflict with Spain required centralized command. Diplomacy demanded coherence. The state could not negotiate effectively while authority remained diffuse. By the late 1650s, the Protectorate governed a nation largely at peace, yet restless. Order had been restored, but enthusiasm had not. Many who had welcomed the fall of monarchy now questioned what had replaced it. Cromwell sensed this unease. His speeches reveal awareness that authority without consent remained fragile. His death in September 1658 exposed the system's dependency on his personal authority. His son Richard lacked military support and political confidence. Within months, The protectorate unraveled. Power drifted back toward the army, then toward Parliament, and finally toward restoration. Cromwell's career thus reveals the limits of revolutionary governance. He did not seek power for its own sake, yet power gathered around him as alternatives failed. His rule demonstrated that dismantling an old order does not eliminate the need for authority. It merely postpones its reconstitution. The revolution had aimed to restrain power. In practice, it displaced it. Cromwell became the focal point through which stability was maintained, not because he desired supremacy, but because the system demanded it. His legacy lies in this contradiction. He embodied both resistance to arbitrary rule and the necessity of centralized authority. His failure was not moral, but structural. England had not yet discovered how to govern without a single center of power. In this sense, Cromwell stands as a transitional figure, bridging collapse and restoration. He did not resolve the revolution's contradictions. He managed them. His life illustrates how revolutions often return, by necessity, to forms they sought to escape, reshaped by experience but bound by the same demands of order. When the monarchy was restored in 1660, England did not return to the world it had known before 1642. The return of Charles II was framed publicly as recovery, healing, and continuity. Yet, beneath the familiar ceremonies lay an altered understanding of authority that could not be undone. The Restoration did not reverse the English Civil War. It absorbed its consequences. The conditions that made restoration possible were shaped by exhaustion rather than conviction. After the death of Oliver Cromwell in September 1658, the political structures that had depended upon his authority weakened rapidly. The protectorate lacked coherence without him. Military power fragmented. Parliament faltered. No faction possessed sufficient legitimacy to govern alone. Stability, long deferred, became the overriding priority. Into this uncertainty stepped General George Monk, whose decision to support the recall of Parliament and facilitate the return of monarchy reflected pragmatic calculation rather than ideological conversion. By early 1660, the prevailing sentiment amongst England's governing classes was not royalist enthusiasm, but recognition that monarchy offered the most familiar framework through which order might be restored. Charles II's return in May 1660 was therefore marked by restraint. The Declaration of Breda, issued in April 1660, promised clemency, religious moderation, and respect for property. These assurances were not expressions of generosity alone. They acknowledged a reality shaped by civil war, that authority could no longer be imposed without consent, nor exercised without sensitivity to memory. The coronation ceremonies revived ritual, symbolism, and language associated with kingship. Yet, the meaning of those rituals had shifted. The crown returned, but it did so under conditions shaped by precedent set during its absence. Parliament resumed its central role. Law reaffirmed its authority. The king governed, but not in isolation. This conditional authority distinguished the Restoration monarchy from its predecessor. Charles II understood, perhaps more instinctively than his father, that survival required accommodation. He did not attempt to resurrect claims of divine absolutism. He accepted limits not because he rejected kingship's sacred dimension, but because experience had demonstrated its vulnerability. England's political culture reflected this adjustment. The memory of war lingered in language, behavior, and expectation. Loyalty was no longer assumed to be unconditional. Obedience was framed increasingly in legal terms, rather than purely moral ones. Resistance, though no longer celebrated, had been normalized as a possibility. The Restoration settlement reinforced this shift. The monarchy was restored alongside Parliament, not above it. The Church of England was re-established, yet with awareness that religious conformity enforced too rigidly risked renewed conflict. Dissent was constrained, but not eradicated. Uniformity returned in form, but not in confidence. This altered continuity extended into governance. The Crown retained influence over administration, foreign policy, and patronage, yet it operated within boundaries shaped by recent history. Financial dependence on Parliament persisted. Standing armies remained politically sensitive. The use of force was restrained by memory of its consequences. Public response reflected cautious relief rather than fervent devotion. Celebrations accompanied the king's return, yet they coexisted with quiet calculation. England had learned that institutions could fail, that authority could be challenged, and that continuity required negotiation. These lessons did not disappear with the restoration of the crown. Cultural memory reinforced this awareness. The regicide of Charles I could not be erased. It was officially condemned, yet it remained a fact that shaped political imagination. The idea that a king could be judged and executed lingered as an unspoken boundary. Monarchy survived, but it did so with knowledge of its limits. This awareness influenced Charles II's conduct. He ruled with flexibility, humor, and pragmatism, avoiding confrontations that might provoke resistance. His governance reflected recognition that authority depended as much on perception as on prerogative. The Restoration monarchy succeeded not by restoring the past, but by adapting to a changed present. England itself had changed. The war had altered relationships between centre and locality, church and conscience, ruler and ruled. Political participation had widened in experience, if not in franchise. Pamphlets, petitions, and public debate had become established features of political life. Silence could no longer be assumed as consent. The Restoration, therefore, represented a negotiated settlement with history. It acknowledged continuity while accepting transformation. The monarchy returned as part of a broader constitutional order, reshaped by conflict. Authority endured, but it did so conditionally, subject to law, memory, and expectation. This conditionality did not weaken England, it stabilized it. By recognizing limits, the Restoration avoided the rigidity that had contributed to collapse. The state regained coherence without denying experience. It allowed memory to inform governance rather than threaten it. The lasting change lay not in institutions alone, but in mindset. England no longer believed that order was automatic. It understood that stability required maintenance, compromise, and restraint. The assumption that authority could command obedience without accountability had been replaced by a more cautious understanding. The Restoration closed the immediate chapter of civil war, but it did not close the questions the war had raised. Those questions would re-emerge in later crises, shaping constitutional development over generations. The balance between Crown and Parliament, order and liberty, unity and conscience remained dynamic rather than fixed. In this way, the Restoration stands as a moment of altered continuity. England resumed familiar forms, yet carried forward altered assumptions. The monarchy survived, but it survived changed. The nation returned to order, but not to innocence. What endured most powerfully was memory. The memory of conflict restrained excess. The memory of rupture tempered authority. The memory of uncertainty shaped governance. England did not forget what it had learned. It incorporated it. The English Civil War ended not with resolution, but with accommodation. The Restoration reflected acceptance that the past could not be restored untouched. Authority would persist, but it would do so under the weight of experience. This was the war's final legacy, Not revolution, not reaction, but recognition that power, once tested, could never again rely solely on inheritance. It required consent, caution, and awareness of consequence. England moved forward not by erasing its fracture, but by remembering it. Thank you for watching this story until the end. If you found this one captivating, you're in for a treat with the next one. It's just as fascinating, if not more, than you could ever imagine. Don't miss out. Click on the image on your screen now to dive into the next adventure.